The rain had not stopped since the morning my father died. I remember standing under the old oak tree outside the funeral home, watching the black cars line up one after another, polished and gleaming despite the storm. My siblings arrived in those cars. I arrived in a taxi I could barely afford, wearing a suit I had borrowed from a friend 3 years earlier for a job interview I never got. My name is Daniel Reyes, and this is the story of how my father's final gift, the one everyone laughed at, became the reason I finally understood what he had been trying to teach me my entire life. Inside the funeral home, my older siblings, Victor and Camille, sat in the front row like royalty accepting condolences. They wore expensive black coats, the kind that cost more than my monthly rent. Around them stood a crowd of relatives, business partners, and family friends, all murmuring about how tragic it was that such a great man had passed and how fortunate his children were to inherit his empire. I sat in the back, alone, the way I usually did at family gatherings. After the service, the lawyer, a tall, quiet man named Mr. Whitman, gathered us all into a private room at the family estate for the reading of the will. The room smelled of old leather and cedar, and sunlight from a single window cut across the long mahogany table where we all sat. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat and began. To my eldest son, Victor, I leave the downtown properties, the investment portfolio, and full ownership of Reyes Enterprises. Victor smiled, barely containing his satisfaction, and glanced at Camille. To my daughter Camille, I leave the family home in Brookline, the vacation property in Aspen, and 40% of my remaining liquid assets. Camille pressed a hand to her chest as if overwhelmed with grief, though I could see the corner of her mouth twitching upward. Then Mr. Whitman turned a page, and the room went quiet. To my youngest son, Daniel, I leave the farmhouse and surrounding land in Millbrook as it stands, with no additional funds attached. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Victor let out a short, sharp laugh. The farmhouse? That old ruin? Dad's really outdone himself this time. He turned to me, still chuckling. Guess that's Dad's final joke on you, Danny boy. Camille didn't even try to hide her smile. At least you'll have somewhere to live, I suppose. Rent-free, even if there's no running water. Laughter rippled through some of the relatives seated at the edges of the room, the kind of laughter that stings more than shouting ever could. My mother, seated beside Victor, said nothing. She simply looked away, the same way she always had whenever I needed her to look at me instead. I said nothing either. I simply reached out, took the small brass key Mr. Whitman offered, and closed my hand around it. That key felt heavier than anything I had ever held. To understand why my father left me a broken-down farmhouse instead of a fortune, you would have to understand the kind of man he was and the kind of relationship we shared, one that none of my siblings ever seemed to value the way I did. My father, Thomas Reyes, built his fortune from nothing. He grew up poor, the son of a mechanic, and he clawed his way into the business world through decades of relentless work. By the time I was born, he already owned several companies, but he never let money change who he was at his core. He believed in honesty. He believed in patience. He believed that the truest measure of a person was not what they inherited, but what they were willing to build with their own 2 hands. Victor and Camille, 10 and 8 years older than me, grew up during the years when my father was still climbing, still working 18-hour days to build the empire that would eventually make them wealthy without ever teaching them what it cost to earn it. By the time I came along, my father had already begun to change. He wanted, I think, a different kind of legacy with his youngest child, one built on values rather than assets. Every Saturday morning, while Victor was out with expensive friends and Camille was shopping with my mother, my father would wake me before sunrise and drive us out to Millbrook, to the old farmhouse that had belonged to his own father. It was a modest weathered building on 40 acres of overgrown land, surrounded by pine trees and a slow-moving creek that cut through the eastern edge of the property. We spent those mornings repairing fences, fixing the roof, clearing brush, and planting vegetables in a garden that never quite thrived, but that my father tended anyway. He taught me how to use a hammer properly, how to patch a leaking pipe, how to read the soil to know when it was ready for planting. This land doesn't look like much now, he told me once, kneeling beside a cracked stone well near the back of the property. But everything valuable starts out looking like nothing, Daniel. People without patience walk right past it. I didn't understand what he meant back then. I was only a boy who wanted to finish the chores and go fishing in the creek. But I never forgot those words. My mother never came with us on those Saturday trips. She considered the farmhouse an embarrassment, a relic from my father's poor upbringing that had no place in the polished life she had built for herself. She poured her attention into Victor and Camille instead, grooming them for a world of status and appearances, teaching them which restaurants to be seen at and which people were worth knowing. I was, in many ways, invisible to her. But I had my father and our Saturday mornings at the farmhouse, and that was enough for me. As the years passed and my father's businesses grew larger, Victor and Camille grew more entitled, more obsessed with the family name and the comfort it afforded them. They rarely visited the farmhouse. When they did, they complained about the mosquitoes, the dust, the lack of proper plumbing, and left within the hour. My father noticed all of it. He never said much about it out loud, but I could see it in the way his eyes lingered on them during family dinners, a quiet disappointment he never spoke aloud. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning, alone in his office, working late as he always did. I was not there. None of us were. But I like to think that somewhere in his final years, as he watched his eldest children grow more distant from the values he'd tried to instill, and watched his youngest son continue driving out to Millbrook on weekends just to keep the old farmhouse standing, he made a decision about what truly mattered. Within a week of the funeral, Victor called me. "Look, Danny, I know the will was a little unconventional," he said, his voice smooth and businesslike, the tone he used when he wanted something. "But let's be practical here. That land isn't worth anything to you. No offense, but you don't exactly have the money to fix a place like that. Camille and I are willing to buy it from you. $20,000. That's more than fair considering the condition it's in. $20,000 for 40 acres of land and a house that had been in our family for 2 generations. I nearly laughed at the audacity of it. "I'll think about it," I told him, though I already knew my answer. Camille called the next day, her voice syrupy with false sympathy. "Daniel, sweetheart, I just think it would be easier for everyone if you took the money. That old house is falling apart. Nobody expects you to fix it. Just sell it and move on with your life." I told her the same thing I told Victor. I would think about it, but I had already made up my mind the moment I held that brass key in my hand at the will reading. My father had given me that farmhouse for a reason, and I intended to find out what that reason was, even if it meant starting over with absolutely nothing. I quit my job at the accounting firm 2 weeks later. It wasn't much of a job anyway, a mid-level position that paid barely enough to cover my small apartment in the city. I sold most of my furniture, packed what little I owned into my car, and drove 3 hours out to Millbrook. The farmhouse looked worse than I remembered. The roof had partially caved in on one side. Weeds had swallowed the garden my father and I once tended. The old well was cracked and dry. Inside, the floorboards creaked dangerously, and there was no electricity, no running water, nothing but dust, silence, and memories. I slept that first night on a sleeping bag in the living room, listening to the wind howl through the broken windows, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But every morning, I woke up and reminded myself of my father's words. Everything valuable starts out looking like nothing. I found work at a hardware store in the nearest town, along with weekend shifts at a local diner just to cover basic expenses. Every spare hour I had, I poured into the farmhouse. I patched the roof myself, learning as I went, ruining more shingles than I successfully installed at first. I dug a new well by hand with the help of a rented auger. I rewired what I could and hired an electrician for the rest, paying him in installments that stretched my budget to its breaking point. Months passed. My hands grew calloused and strong. My bank account remained nearly empty, but the farmhouse, slowly, painfully, began to look like a home again. I did not speak to Victor or Camille during this time. They did not reach out either, aside from one text message from Camille asking if I had come to my senses yet, about selling. I had never felt more certain of anything in my life. The discovery happened almost by accident, nearly 8 months after I moved in. I was clearing brush near the eastern edge of the property, close to the creek, when I noticed the ground was unusually soft and cool even during the peak of summer heat. Curious, I dug a small trench and found that the creek was fed by an underground spring, one far larger and more consistent than I had ever realized as a child. I mentioned it, almost in passing, to a geologist who came through town doing survey work for the county. He asked if he could test the water. A week later, he came back with results that changed everything. The spring was not just a water source. It was a rare, mineral-rich natural spring, the kind increasingly sought after by wellness companies, bottled water brands, and small resort developers. According to his estimates, properties with confirmed access to a spring of this quality and volume could be worth significantly more than standard farmland, especially given the growing market for natural spring water and ecotourism destinations. I sat by that creek for hours after he left, staring at the water, remembering my father kneeling beside the old well, telling me that everything valuable starts out looking like nothing. He had known. I was almost certain of it. He had grown up on this land. He must have known about the spring, or at least suspected its potential, long before I ever dug that trench. I did not rush into anything. I spent the next year researching, consulting with agricultural and environmental lawyers, and slowly building a plan. I secured proper water rights and environmental permits, working with the county to ensure everything was done legally and sustainably. I took out a small business loan, using the farmhouse and land as collateral, a terrifying decision that kept me awake many nights. With that loan, I built a modest bottling facility on a corner of the property, hired 3 local employees, and launched a small spring water brand under the name Reyes Springs, a quiet tribute to my father. The first year was slow and difficult, but the water quality spoke for itself, and word began to spread. A regional grocery chain agreed to stock our bottles. Then a wellness retreat 2 counties over began ordering in bulk. Within 2 years, Reyes Springs had grown from a single bottling line to a legitimate regional brand. I renovated the farmhouse fully, restoring its original charm while modernizing the interior. I built a handful of small guest cabins along the creek, renting them out to travelers drawn to the peaceful property and its natural spring. I expanded into hosting small farm-to-table events and seasonal harvest festivals, turning the once-neglected land into a destination people traveled hours to visit. A local newspaper ran a feature on the transformation, titled, "From Ruins to Riches, the Millbrook Spring Water Story." The article detailed how a struggling young man had turned an abandoned family property into a thriving business through nothing but stubborn determination and hard work. The story was picked up by a regional television segment shortly after, and within a year, Reyes Springs had become a genuinely well-known name in the area. I had built something real, something entirely my own, out of the very thing my family had once mocked as my father's cruel final joke. The calls started coming again almost as soon as the newspaper article was published. Victor called first, his voice warm and friendly in a way it had never been before. "Danny, I saw the article. That's incredible work, honestly. We should catch up soon. Maybe I could bring the family out for a weekend at the cabins?" I agreed, cautiously, still holding on to some hope that perhaps success had genuinely changed something in him. It hadn't. Within weeks, Camille was calling too, asking if she and her husband could stay at the cabins for free. "Just this once, family discount, right?" Then came requests for jobs, for Victor's college-age son to be given a management position at the bottling facility despite having no relevant experience. Then came requests for loans, thinly disguised as investment opportunities they wanted to offer me. I declined most of these requests as politely as I could, offering standard rates and standard hiring processes instead of favors. This, apparently, was unforgivable. The lawsuit came almost a year later, filed jointly by Victor and Camille. Their claim was that our father had never truly intended for me to have sole, unrestricted ownership of the farmhouse and land, arguing instead that it had always been meant as a shared family asset that I had wrongfully developed and profited from without their consent. They produced a supposed early draft of the will, dated years before the final version, suggesting the property was originally meant to be split 3 ways. They hired an aggressive law firm and began spreading rumors throughout Millbrook, telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated our elderly, ailing father into changing his will in my favor during his final years. Some of these rumors reached my own employees. A few local suppliers grew hesitant to continue working with Reyes Springs, worried about the legal cloud now hanging over the property. For the first time since I moved into that farmhouse, I felt the ground beneath me shift. My father's lawyer, Mr. Whitman, the same quiet man who had read the will that day, reached out to me himself once he learned of the lawsuit. "Daniel," he said during our meeting at his office, "your father anticipated this. Years ago, actually. Long before his health declined." He opened a drawer and retrieved a sealed envelope, one that had remained locked in his firm's records since before my father's death, to be opened only in the event of a legal dispute over the will. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father, along with detailed financial records proving that Victor and Camille had already received substantial early inheritances years earlier, disguised as business loans and property gifts, specifically to balance the value of what they would later inherit through the will. The letter itself was the part that affected me most deeply. In it, my father explained that he had indeed known about the spring on the Millbrook property, having discovered it himself decades earlier, but never having the resources or health to develop it properly. He wrote that he chose to leave the land to me specifically because I was the only one of his children who had ever appreciated it for what it was, rather than what it could be sold for. He wrote that true inheritance was never about money, but about whether a person could be trusted to build something meaningful and lasting. He said he trusted me more than he had ever trusted Victor or Camille with anything of real value, and that this trust was, in itself, the greatest gift he had to give. I read that letter 3 times before I could speak again. The courtroom proceedings that followed lasted nearly 4 months. Victor and Camille's legal team attempted to present the alleged early draft of the will as evidence, but forensic document analysis quickly revealed the paper and ink to be inconsistent with the timeline they claimed. Several witnesses they had lined up to testify about my father's supposed declining mental state in his final years crumbled under basic cross-examination, unable to provide consistent or credible accounts. Mr. Whitman presented the sealed letter and the financial records documenting the early inheritances Victor and Camille had already received. The judge reviewed everything carefully over several sessions, ultimately dismissing every claim brought against me and ordering Victor and Camille to cover the full legal costs of the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, Victor refused to make eye contact with me. Camille simply walked past without a word. I would like to say that watching my siblings lose their case was satisfying, and in a quiet way, it was. But the deeper satisfaction came in the years that followed, not through any revenge I orchestrated, but through the natural consequences of the choices they had always made. Victor, having built his portion of the business empire on aggressive short-term decisions rather than sustainable growth, saw Reyes Enterprises collapse under a series of bad investments and mounting debt within a few years. Camille's lavish lifestyle eventually outpaced her remaining inheritance, and the properties she once boasted about were sold off one by one to cover expenses. Reyes Springs, meanwhile, continued to grow steadily, built on patience, honest work, and reinvestment rather than shortcuts. We expanded distribution into 3 neighboring states. The cabins became a sought-after retreat destination. The farmhouse stood fully restored, warm and welcoming, exactly as it had been in my earliest memories with my father, only now surrounded by a business that had grown from those very memories. When Victor eventually called, his voice quieter and more desperate than I had ever heard it, asking if there was any way I could help him financially, I found myself surprisingly calm. Dad gave each of us exactly what we deserved, I told him gently, without malice, simply stating what had become undeniably clear over the years. I hope you find your way through this, Victor, but I can't be the solution to choices that were never mine to make. He didn't call again after that. Today, the farmhouse stands fully restored, its wooden porch overlooking the creek where my father once taught me to fix fences and read the soil. The spring continues to flow steadily, feeding both the business and the quiet sense of purpose that has carried me through every difficult year since that rainy funeral day. I established a small scholarship fund in my father's name, offering support to young people from working-class backgrounds pursuing trade skills and small business education. The same kind of practical, patient knowledge my father spent so many Saturday mornings teaching me. Every year, on the anniversary of his passing, I visit his grave. I bring a small jar of drawings, quiz.